Um, Good evening and welcome to the shiur by Rabbi Dovid Katz. The topic being thinking about the Crusades in the context of modern times. I've been sent an absolutely fabulous and very long bio of Rabbi Katz, and I think a praise of it would be Michael Stawford's words, he's a superstar. Rabbi Katz will speak and questions and answers will be towards the end. When it comes to questions and answers, feel free to either send me a question in the chat box or to speak directly. With that, I give you Rabbi Katz.
You're farther ahead in the fast than I am. On the other hand, I just spent 5 hours doing the keynotes in Baltimore for a bunch of congregations. So you'll understand that I'm a little bit wiped out. Fellow fasters. I was asked to say a few words about the Crusades, which I guess I understand because we recite this in the keynotes. It's a famous piece of the Tisha of liturgy. Has nothing to do with the Churban Beis Hamikdash. First temple, second, it's a different time. But we are Ashkenazic Jews, most of us, I assume I'm speaking to. And it got hardwired into the Ashkenazic consciousness back in the end of the 11th century that we're a certain type of people. And part of us is that our memory is seared by what happened in 1096. Because when they speak about the Crusades, basically what they're usually talking about, if you know anything about history, is the First Crusade. There were others, but the Jews, I could give a long talk on that, but I'm not going. The others were not as affecting on the Jews. The first one hit them like a hammer. And it's in light of the world that you and I currently live in the year 2020. You guys in the UK, live in the US, it's a little bit of a scary story because the Crusades, I think everybody knows, were the religious wars that broke out in the end of the 1000s. Basically, it was a constant war, perhaps still is, between the Christians and the Islam. That time was a formal war, punctuated by truces. That was not peace, punctuated by war, but the other way around. And in the theology of both religions in the Middle Ages, that was the norm. You're always fighting against the heretics, the unbelievers, punctuated by truces. Without going into a long arichas, as they say, the Muslims conquered the Holy Land in their crusade, which is called the Jihad. And then a couple hundred years later, for certain reasons, the Christians want to do their way, they call it Crusade. Take over the Holy Land. Now, this should not directly affect the Jews. The specific circumstances that caused the Pope to summon a meeting in Clermont in France in 1095 and call upon Christian chivalry, the knights, the people, to go and undertake a holy war, had nothing to do with the Jews specifically. And there were very few Jews in Christendom altogether, although relative to the numbers, there was something of a concentration in the Rhineland. Small, but something of a concentration, and to some degree in France. You all know, I'm sure, Rashi lived in Champagne. Rashi lived at this time. He was not in the Crusades, because as we'll see in a minute, the Crusades didn't hit Champagne. They went right next to it in the Rhineland, which is not the same thing. You're Europeans. I can't explain it to an American audience, but you guys live next door. And so the Rhineland is not France. It's near there. When the Pope proclaimed the Crusade, there was a great enthusiasm, and all over Western Europe, groups formed spontaneously and formed themselves into armies and took off one way or another for Palestine. None of those groups bothered the Jews. It's just interesting. In southern France and Germany, Italy, none of those groups bothered the Jews because the Jews had nothing to do with this. If the Christians win, the Jews will be an inferior group. If the Muslims win, the Jews will be an inferior group. It's the 11th century. The Jews aren't going anywhere. One group, however, which formed, I guess what you say today, Belgium, something like that, that was the one that caused all the trouble. Because this particular group went down the Rhine, and they did so with the intention of killing the Jews, or at least forcing them to convert. That's very important. The thing about the Crusades is a holy war, and therefore it was under Christianity, and therefore it was not Hitler. It was not Hitler. If you convert, you will live. That's the reason we say in Judaism that all those who perished in the Crusades were what you call Kedoshim, or martyrs, that are Kiddush Hashem. What made it a martyrdom was the fact that they could have saved their lives by converting, and they chose not to. Okay? And that's not the same thing as the Holocaust, where, as you know, the idea was racial extermination, and even Jews who had converted were going to be killed anyway by Hitler on racial basis. That's not what we're talking about 1,000 years ago. And so it's important to keep this in mind. Now, the Jews in that part of the world, called Western Europe, have formed what you and I call Ashkenazic civilization. As I say, for most of us, this is our ancestors, and has certain features to it. One of the features is a very interesting set of religious laws and customs, minhagim. Ashkenaz is the happy hunting ground for minhag. And it got hardwired, as I said before, into the Ashkenazi consciousness. If my Bubby and Zaidi did it, it's the right thing to do. I don't care what it says in the books. Because my grandfather was Rashi or somebody like that. And if this is what he did on Shabbat, don't tell me that the book says it's wrong, because he couldn't have done anything wrong. This is the way to do it. Anybody knows the first thing about Gemara knows that in the very first page of the Talmud, it talks about when is the time for Kriyat Shema, and it says at a certain time at night. And immediately Rashi and Tosfot immediately say, well, we don't do like that. How can we daven early of Myra? And it doesn't even enter their minds that we're doing something wrong, even though the book said they're doing something wrong. There's got to be some reason. Because if you're Ashkenazic, if your ancestors did it, then it's the right thing to do. That's the right way to practice Judaism. It's just interesting. Now, one group of crusaders, as they call them, formed themselves and said that in addition to going after the Muslims in the Holy Land, they're also going to go after the Jews. In the sense that they want this whole area to be Juden Rhine, free of Jews, not in the Hitler sense, but that there should be no one practicing the Jewish religion. So if they would have had their way, and if all the Jews would mass convert, then it seems that they would just pass through. They would rob their goods or something like that and march on. The Jews, however, being strongly religious at that time, being very proud of their origins, even though we're talking about the 11th century, it sounds funny, but the Ashkenazi Jews already consider themselves to be of ancient vintage. Okay, even though they weren't there that long, and they consider themselves to be descendants of the old Jews of Jerusalem. They had such stories, and certainly they cultivated what was one of the highest levels of rabbinic scholarship, Talmudic scholarship, which is funny. And so there were yeshivas and things like this on the Rhine, much earlier than the time of Rashi. And in the Europe of that time, there weren't many roads, and the rivers were the main avenues of commerce. And naturally, Jews who wanted to be in a mercantile situation, make money as merchants, you're always going to try to locate yourself near a river, because that's where the commerce is going to be. It is very famous and often quoted in the history books that the Archbishop in Mainz, Rudiger, gave a speech in which he said, since I wanted to build up my city and make it famous, by which he meant I wanted to make it a commercial center, I invited a bunch of Jews to settle here. So the Jews were part and parcel of the Rhineland economy. This was at that time called the Holy Roman Empire. The local authorities were okay with the Jews being there. They wanted them to be there for commercial purposes. I might say that the Jews had a very good relationship with the Holy Roman Emperor at that time, Henry IV, who's a very famous figure if you know anything about European history, because he's the one that had the battle with the Pope, and in the end, he had to go on his knees to Canossa. You probably learned this in school somewhere along the line. Him and the Pope were always battling, and he was a very independent figure, very much like the English King Henry II, the same type. And he liked the Jews, and they got along very well, because Henry IV was a big skeptic about Christianity anyway, for various reasons. And the Jews were not a problem to him at all. The opposite, they were an asset. The Rhineland massacres, the Crusades that we talk about in the keynotes today, happened because the emperor was not in town. He was in Italy. At that time, the Holy Roman Empire included Italy, and he was there fighting with the Pope. As soon as he heard that these massacres had taken place, he rushed back to Germany and tried to fix matters, but it's too late. So the point I'm trying to make is that the Crusades happened, the violence that we call the Crusades, the anti-Jewish violence associated with the Crusades of Tatanu of 1096 happened in spite of the fact that the local authorities did not want it, the local police did not want it, the imperial government and the emperor didn't want it, and frankly, the Catholic Church did not call for it. So this is what makes it scary for you and I living in 2020. The violence can just blow up, despite the fact that your local authorities have nothing to do with it, and you're actually in very good relations with them. And on a day-to-day basis, something like this would be unthinkable. And then the unthinkable shows up, composed of some mob that formed out of town, having nothing to do with local conditions. What did the Crusades have to do with the Jews of mice or spires or worms or any of that sort of thing? Nets. Some crazy business. And the whole world then turned upside down. And by the time you're finished, the entire community has been slaughtered or something along those lines. This is what makes the Crusades episode for the student of Jewish history uncomfortable reading in 2020, because we in the West, live in situations in which we say the local authorities are fine, the government is fine, violence doesn't break out typically on a big level. But then almost out of nowhere, this emerged and blew up. I don't know what you fellows all did with the keynotes. What we did where I live in Baltimore was the number of shows got together, we did on Zoom, because of the corona. And I spoke at great length there about the 4 keynotes that are part of the collection that we do, that we recite on Tisha. What we do in Baltimore, or at least what I do, is I have a list of 18 that I've selected, and those are the ones that we do together, which I explicate, and I always include the 4 that are of the Crusades. There are many of the keynotes that are about the Bayis Sheni, and they're poetic and formulaic, because the people who wrote the keynotes about the Churbans are doing it from imagination. They were not there. Rabbi Elazar HaKaliri, for example, whenever he lived, didn't live at that time, he lived much later. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi was in the Middle Ages. He didn't live in the time of destruction of the temple. So these are poets, Paitanim we call them. These are religious poets who are trying through the means of poetry and the literary imagination to evoke for us, the worshipers, what it must have been like in some sense. And that's why they have this kind of very stylistic and, what shall I say, rhetorical character, and they quote from the Talmud and the Medrash, and they do it in certain ways. By contrast, the 4 keynotes that we recite from the Crusades are eyewitness accounts by people who were there, and therefore they write in an altogether different vein. Whereas the regular keynotes dealing with the Beis Hamikdash always say it was our fault and God punished us because we deserved it, because of the sins of this and the sins of that, you always return to that thing. By contrast, when you talk to four people who write the four keynotes on the Crusades, they don't say that at all. They say, I have kindness on you. Why did you do this, God? We didn't deserve this. Because when you write something stylistically, but something happened long ago in a very frum way, that's one kind of rhetorical stance. Someone who himself was in Auschwitz has a different feeling about this. And if you see the keynotes, they even start with shut up, leave me alone. Don't tell me to be quiet. I want to say whatever I say. And I don't care what happens to me. You see his neighbors are saying, oh, quiet down. Get off of me. I want to be bitter, and I want to say what I want to say. And over again, in these keynotes, which we include in our liturgy, the person says, how can you let this happen, God? Why is this happening? Do something. And what they can't stand more than anything else is the lack of punishment for the perpetrators. Because what you have to understand, when we get to the Crusades, is something that maybe we don't think about, and that is the following. Unlike the 20th century, when the survivors, for the most part, of, say, for example, the Holocaust, what they did, by and large, was pick up and move the heck out of there. They came to the States, they came to the UK to some degree, they went to Israel. So somebody suffered in Poland, in Lithuania, and Ukraine, and Hungary, wherever. But now they're in New York, in London, in Jerusalem. And so they completely removed themselves, properly so, from the scene of the horrors that they and their families endured. By contrast, in earlier Jewish history, our ancestors didn't have the luxury of doing that. So I want you to talk a little bit about social history and understand, if I were living, let's say, for example, in Mainz, and I had a store, and I have customers, and then all hell broke loose, and the Crusaders showed up, and for a week it was terrible. And by the time it's over, they killed my wife and children and all the rest of it. Happened all the time. And then it's over. The Crusaders blow through like a bad wind, and then law and order is restored. The imperial authorities show up, and then things go back. What do? I can only pick up life. What do? I got to make a living. I reopen my store. I clean it up. I restock. And who are my customers the following Monday morning, the following Tuesday morning? Who are my customers? The people who participated. It's that. This is the situation of our ancestors. And this you find referred to again and again in the keynotes that we recited today. I'm assuming that you recited them. Well, I don't know what your system is in there, Yisrael. I'm talking about what we do. And it's remarkable because I'm the Jew and I have to just swallow it. He's my customer. You might be wearing my wife's ring. Right? You see? And I just have to do it. And therefore, the Python says in the keynotes, God, why don't you avenge the wrong that was done? Because they don't have the luxury to see the Nakama, as it were. You know what I'm saying? And this is the real life. This is what we mean by the Crusades. You understand? Specifically, this particular group that started in Belgium went down the Rhine. They said they're going to make all the Jews convert or kill. The Jews thought that they could pay them off. That usually worked. In this particular case, it did not work. And it came clear that in spite of taking the bribes, they're going to come in and either kill the Jews or force them to convert. At this point, in 1096, something unique happened in Jewish history. They had the mass suicides. Usually, in the Jewish tradition, the way it's normatively understood, you're not supposed to do suicide. Right? You're not supposed to do suicide. In the rabbinic tradition, Masada doesn't count. That's from Josephus. We don't know if it's a true story or not. In the rabbinic tradition, the only examples we have of suicide, as far as I can think of, is King Saul and the 400 boys and girls that jump off the ship when they were taken after the destruction of Beis Hamikdash to be used in brothels in Rome. The famous story in the Talmud. I imagine some of you have heard of it. I believe that's it. Now, that's not a basis of any ruling. In spite of what I just told you, spontaneously, it's remarkable. In 1096, in that terrible May and June, which is when all this hit, time of Shavuos, in May and June, maybe July, whole communities, or lots of people in the communities, just up and said like this: they're coming, they're a block away, they're a mile away, 2 miles away. Let's all get together. If we can't hold out against them, and it doesn't look like we can because we're a small number against a large one, we're going to all kill ourselves. Now, I want you to understand what that means. And this is described in the keynotes there. Did you all recite these keynotes today, Ken? Raise your hand if you recited what I'm talking about today. Okay. So what they immediately said was as follows: committing suicide means I'm killing me. Who kills my wife and who kills my children? Me. So it's not suicide in the regular sense, which is horrific enough, but it's much more horrific because people kill their whole families. You get it? Which is described in detail in the keynotes and in the other accounts that have survived. But the keynotes, to my mind, are the most graphic and raw because they're written immediately after the massacres by eyewitnesses who talk about the fact that they're going crazy with the depression caused by these memories. And that's something that you and I can associate with, since we are, if not the generation of the Holocaust, we're the generation after the Holocaust or two. So we're familiar with this notion of trauma, which is described very vividly over there. Now, that means that people got themselves together and they divided into family units, and then the father killed the family and then killed himself. I used to think by most of the accounts that what they did was a shechita, they shechted, which is terrible enough. And that certainly happened. There's no question about that in great amounts. But I saw today, when I was reviewing it for the umpteenth time, he talks about the fact that people smashed in the heads of family members as well. It's unbelievable. Now this means that in their minds, suicide was number one, okay. Number two, a mitzvah. Number three, a mitzvah of Kiddush Hashem. And ever since then, since they did it, and we're talking about Ashkenazic Jews, all the Ashkenazic rabbis afterwards say like this: I wouldn't have thought that suicide is okay, but if they did it, and they were holy and great people, and they were, it must be, it's okay sometimes. You understand? It must be, it's okay. And ever since then, in the Ashkenazic tradition, this was never repeated. They did not do this in later history. For example, when you had the Kazakh massacres of 1648, there were many Jewish communities that died al pi Kiddush Hashem, meaning the Kazakhs and the others gave them a choice of converting to Ukrainian Orthodoxy or dying, and they died, but you never find that they committed suicide. But nevertheless, nobody says that there's anything wrong with what these people did, because it's from the time of Rashi and the time of the Balitosis, or a little before that, and so on and so forth. It's quite remarkable. But it means that father's going and smashing in the heads of his kids and his wife, all the rest of it, and then he has to figure out how to kill himself, which, nobody knows how to do that. And so we saw a reference in the keynotes today of a guy doing Japanese style, stabbing himself, Megoalim Badam Bar Chavot. And he's rolling in his blood in the street. And the idea was to kill him before the Crusaders get them. Now, what does this mean? They had such strong feelings on the subject that they considered Christianity an avodah zarah, and they would prefer to kill their children because they're so certain if they die the death of martyrs, they'll be in heaven. So that's infinitely better than letting them be converted to Christianity and living the life of idol worshippers as they saw it. It's quite remarkable. It's quite remarkable. And it happened over and over again. And it became, unfortunately, in the 12th century, 13th century, not uncommon, right? There is, to my mind, a very horrific and famous Shaila sent to Myron Rottenberg, who was the big rabbi in the 13th century in Germany. I'm sure you've heard of him, the Mayor Rottenberg. And he was a big guy. And I remember it reading it long ago. It happened in Koblenz, on the Rhine, in Koblenz. And basically, the guy said they was in this Jewish community, and they heard a whole mob coming, and they immediately formed the conclusion that the mob is coming like a Crusader type situation to compel the Jews to convert. And the family knew the drill, and immediately got him and his wife and his children together, and they made the bracha Sheikh Yisrael Mitzvah Al Kiddush Hashem, make a bracha like that, and then he killed his whole family, and before he could kill himself, the mob ran right through the street by his house. In other words, they were headed in a different direction on a different motive. He just misjudged the situation. And now he looked at the dead in his family, and what he wanted to know, being a medieval Ashkenazic Jew, is how do I atone for the sin I've done through penance? Not through repentance, but through penance. Teshuvah has several meanings. They're not identical. Teshuvah can mean repentance. Teshuvah also means, in Jewish literature, penance. Being that this is a British audience, I don't have to explain the difference. Okay? Penance, you do something to yourself. And you want to know, what does he have to do? Does he have to fast? Does he have to be whipped? Does he have to do this? Go into exile, whatever. Because he killed people, his own family. And the Myron Rottenberg wrote to him and said, you don't have to do anything. What happened to you is a tragedy, not a sin. It's a tragedy, not a sin. Because that's what people do when they think the Crusaders are coming, you know? That was standard operating procedure. Shows you the temper of the times. You understand? Now, because it is, as I said before, the Xeris of Tatnu, the massacres, the self-inflicted massacres of the suicides, formed a powerful image in the Jewish mind. There was a very famous historian who passed away 20 years ago, 25 years ago, Jacob Katz from the Hebrew University. Maybe some of you heard the name. Very famous person. And he wrote an article, a book actually, we talk about ritual instinct, in which there's a Tosafot who lived in the 12th century. The Tosafot lived right after this, in the 1100s. The events I'm talking about happened in 1096. The Bali Tosafos were in the early 1100s. And without getting too technical, there's a question in Judaism, is it, if you know the Gemara, is it the big three or the big two? What are the three things a Jew is supposed to give his life for? Is it Gila Rai Shvicha Dam Avodah Zarah, or just Gila Rai Shvicha Dam Menan Avodah Zarah? Which is surprising. It's in the Talmud in Sanhedrin. Does a person have to give his life? Gila Rai is immorality, right? You understand? No, rather than engage in a forbidden sexual relationship of the severe Rai, he has to give his life, right? For example, in other words, somebody says like this, do it with your mother, your sister, I'll kill you. You have to die. And a murder, if somebody said, kill this guy or I'll kill you. Today, I think we've all heard this. The third one is bow down to worship idols. Not so simple. In the Gemara, there's a discussion, Shitas Rabbi Yishmael, whether Avodah Zarah is a chayiv misa, is a kiddush Hashem or not. Are you required to give it your life? And there is a passage in the Talmud in Avodah Zarah where it seems like that the liberal view prevailed, that really you don't have to give your life for Avodah Zarah. And Tosfos immediately recoils and says, like this is impossible. We have to look for another interpretation, because it would have meant the Jews in the Crusades were wrong, and that's unthinkable. It's unthinkable. So Here we have, therefore, the Jewish reaction in this horrific way. We also have, if you look closely in some of the keynotes, and also in what we call the Crusader Chronicles, there are 4 Jewish accounts written in Hebrew at that time by the survivors and so forth, which describe, the experience that they had during that terrible year. And in some of them, you have this formulaic stuff. All the Jews got together and decided to commit suicide. And in others, you have a more realistic point of view presented, in which it's like this. The leaders decided to do this. Now, the children didn't want to get killed. If you're 5 years old, you don't want to get killed. Go say, oh, you're dying, I'll kiddush them. What does that mean? And the parents are chasing the children around to kill them. And this is in the second of the keynotes, if you know how to read it today, where the children are saying, Hareinu nitbachim v'nishchatim. We're getting killed over. What are you doing to us? And the parents are doing it anyway. So it's unthinkable in a Jewish context for Jews to act this way, and yet it happened. It happened. This goes to show you how strong the feelings were in the religious divide in medieval Europe. Okay, the Christians had absolute hatred for Judaism. The Jews had absolute hate for Christianity. That's how it went. Okay? That's how it went. They saw it as an idolatry and nothing to talk about. I understand you could talk to me with a Catholic PhD and they could say it's all symbolic. That's not how they saw it. It's not how they saw it. It's just interesting. So we have these features of the Crusades, which again are food for thought. What do you do when you have religious groups that hate each other? Here we are in 2020. There's another aspect that strikes as powerful. In addition to what I said, the hatred and the suicides and all that sort of thing, the Jews found themselves in a funny situation. And again, I'm trying to share with you a little bit of social history. You take a community. Whatever they say in the book, not everybody did this. So let's say, for example, you have a community of 600 or 700 people. And then this terrible business happens. So let's say 400 people, 500 perished, committed suicide. Let's just say that. So that means another 200-300 did not. So what did they do? They converted. But why did they convert? Scared to death. I'll tell you something. The Crusaders passed through. Not long afterwards, the Holy Roman Emperor returned in a rush from Italy, Henry IV. He was outraged that this breakdown in law and order had happened. He punished the local officials, and he convened a conference of the Catholic bishops called the Conference of Constance, and they issued a ruling that the Jews who were converted by force can go back to being Jewish. Isn't that interesting? In other words, what happened in Germany in 1096 was different than what happened in Spain in 1391. In Spain, the Jews were compelled by violence to convert, and then the Catholic bishops took the position that even though it wasn't right, but once they converted, they converted. Can't pull out. By contrast, after the First Crusade, in Germany, the Catholic Church took a different position under pressure of the emperor, and they said this was done against Catholic teaching, and to force somebody to convert when they don't mean it doesn't count. Therefore, you can go back to being Jewish, and they did. The question goes like this: that's a whole can of worms by itself. Now, these 200 people come back. They come out of the woodwork. They take off the cross. They put back the mezuzah. And now you walk into the synagogue, and guess what? All the seats are empty, or most of them, because everybody committed suicide. And so, you know what you do? You say, I guess, I always wanted to have a seat in the front next to the window. I never could afford it. by default now, I'm getting Rothschild seat. The only problem is, Mrs. Rothschild is still alive, survived the massacre somehow, and she's outraged. You are counting for a million? You are sitting in my husband's seat? You can get an aliyah? Right? Or you're a lady that did this, you get now to be the head of the mikveh committee or something? It's outrageous. My family perished al Kiddush Hashem. You guys made a chilul Hashem. You did the coward's way out. It's enough even we take you back. You understand? That you should claim full membership in the Jewish community and all the rights accruing to that is an outrage, is unjust. And a great wave of emotion, which is completely understandable, swept the Ashkenazi communities, the survivors, right? Usually what happened was somebody was a relative from another town where the Crusaders didn't hit, and they showed up over here, and they were outraged. Of course, it's not fair. They were not hit. I told you before, where Rashi lived was close to where the Crusaders came, but they didn't come there. So as they say in Yiddish, up you come in Shrek. Rashi's community was scared to death, but in point of fact, nothing happened. You understand? It's like living in Romania in World War II. The Germans never did take the Jews away. They're just scared to death. And so these Jews come and they say, how can these traitors, these renegades, these cowards come and now claim the rights of the Jewish community? Imagine if somebody says, I want to be a rabbi over here, and he converted under duress and so forth. What do? This tore the survivors and their communities apart, which we can totally understand. I'm not here to judge anybody, neither are you. We're here to describe. We're here to talk about the Crusades in light of modern times. We modern people can totally understand this. It just ripped apart the fabric of society. And what do? Fortunately, to some degree, the Ashkenazi Jews at that time in 1097 had somebody whose authority they respected, and that was Rashi. Right, Rashi. As I said before, Rashi was born and lived in France, in Champagne. I say Champagne because France didn't really exist as a country at that time. There was something called the King of France, but he only ruled like Paris in that area. Not really. Only that. Most of the other areas were sort of independent dukedoms and baronies. You know what I'm saying? I think you might know in English history that, the kings of England at that time were the Dukes of Normandy. The King of France didn't rule there. They did. Correct? William the Conqueror. And by the time Henry II was finished, he owned more of France than the King of France because he married Eleanor of Aquitaine. Anyway, so Rashi lived in the county of Champagne. And in Troyes. So Rashi lived there except for 5 or 6 years when he went to yeshiva. When Rashi was a teenager and a young man, he went for something at 5, 6 years, something like that, to the Rhineland, to Mainz and Worms. Because that was the big yeshivas at that time. That's where we had Gateshead, to use English terms, right? It was in Mainz. And he learned there, and then he came back home, married, and he settled in Troyes, and he did his learning and all that. And over the course of his lifetime, he acquired a great authority and reputation. And so, even though one's in France and one's in Germany, they're all Ashkenazi Jews, they're all cousins. They're all cousins. And Rashi often in his writings quotes from the Rhineland. His Rebbes were, Rhineland Jews. That's who he was. And so these people respected his authority, and they said, what should we do about this terrible crisis, which is ripping communities apart? Because it's not fair that these people who converted under duress should now claim the rights to be full membership in the Jewish community and maybe even positions of authority. It's not right. And my husband and my son and my brother and my cousin, all this, they perished. And now, as I said before, their seat in shul goes to this person, and their Sefer Torah is now used by this person, and so on and so forth. And Rashi wrote a famous letter in which he said, tough luck. if a Jew comes back, you just have to take him back. You're not allowed to say Zechor Masecha Rishonim, as the expression goes. You can't call up to them their past. He said that's the way we have to go. And I don't know if this. Listen, I wasn't there. I don't know if this was adhered to, but to some degree it had to be. Aside from being the council of wisdom, this is a council of pragmatism. Agree? There's a pragmatism. What are you going to do? But on the other hand, I'm sure it certainly colored the life of the survivors for a long time afterwards. The same way you and I, who are basically, if I can judge by what I see, the generation after the Holocaust, our lives have been affected by what our parents' generation went through, for better and worse, right? For better and worse. And so the Crusades leave a rich legacy, a complicated legacy of what you call survivor trauma and survivor syndrome. And one thing it certainly did, it powerfully reinforced the Ashkenazi, what I call ancestor worship that I referred to before. Because the people used to say, my Bubby did it, my Zadie did it, my other did it. If you say, you're not allowed to do this on Shabbat, and a guy said like this, my grandmother always used to cook this on Shabbat. And the guy said, well, I'm looking in the Sefer, it says you're not allowed to do it. My grandmother died al Kiddush Hashem. Don't tell me that what she did was wrong. She's one of the Kedoshim and the Kedoshot, whose memory is preserved in the liturgy in the synagogue. And then I can tell you right away, the rabbi's going to back off. Because that's Ashkenaz. You see? That's Ashkenaz. Because these generations totally willingly, gave up their lives without even discussion for Judaism, anything associated with them became sacred. And the notion that we follow the example in practice and also in outlook and hashkafa, the fact that we follow their example became a key part of the Ashkenazi Jewish character, and it is preserved today in what we call the yeshiva world. Because the origins of the yeshivaism goes back to these early centuries, and particularly the Crusades, in which you had the attitude, the Torah is to be cultivated intensely, the outside world is hostile, we stick together, we follow the example of our predecessors, and the rest of the world doesn't like it, they can all go to the devil. That's the Ashkenazi culturally insular attitude, which over the centuries became part and parcel of what we call today yeshivaism. You understand? At least that's what we call in the States. Right? Yeshivaism. There's a fundamental difference between the Ashkenazi Jews on the one hand and the Jews in the Arab world like the Sephardim on the other, because the Ashkenazi Jews grew up in medieval Europe. The Sephardic Jews and others grew up in medieval Islam. The Islamic world, in its own internal development, after the Caliphate was formed in the 7th century, developed along the lines in which the Jews spoke Arabic, and the Arabs themselves developed a secular culture side by side with the religious culture. I think you know this. I'm talking about the Middle Ages. They developed such things as mathematics and science and philosophy and things like that, geography, physics, chemistry. And so if I were Jewish and living, for example, in the time of Rambam, if I wish to, there's secular studies that I, number one, am able to access because I can read Arabic. And number two, there's nothing treif about it. There's nothing treif about geometry. You see, the most religious person had no trouble in doing math and science. Philosophy, maybe, but not math and science. By contrast, the Ashkenazi Jews, like in the time of the Crusades, lived in a Europe in which there was no secularity whatsoever. Medieval Europe, especially in the High Middle Ages, was characterized by the totalizing influence of Roman Catholicism, in which all life and every aspect of culture and intellectuality was subsumed to the religion. That basically means like this. There's no library. There's no bookstore. There's no internet. There's no, it's no, television. So if I were a boy or a girl living in Tamarashi, and I had any intellectual interest whatsoever, what do? There's no place to go and read anything. There are no books. I mean, how many times can you read Beowulf? There are no books. People aren't writing them. They're writing books about Christianity, Lives of the Saints, Catholic doctrine, which is interesting if you're a believer of that. They're not interesting to a Jew. You understand? So where's the secular area? The math and the science, as we call it today. And it didn't exist. So that's why the Ashkenazi Jews already are inwardly turned. If you have any intellectuality, you're going to put it into Gemara, to Chumash, and that sort of thing. This became tremendously intensified by the experience of the Tatnu of the 1096. Okay? So that's basically what I wanted to share with you. I think, and I'll leave again by repeating, I think to me, it's very disturbing that the Crusades happened even in the context where the political system was good, so to speak, for the Jews. If you know the stories, and I assume if you sat in the keynotes, you must have read the books. Some Jews were tried to be sheltered by the authorities. The Archbishop of Mainz, you will remember, brought some people into his palace. Others were given a tower. It didn't help. It didn't help. The mob, becomes a mob, and the local police authorities are just insufficient. The police are good for everyday matters. A robbery here, a thing there, whatever. That was a big mob. And it proved all too easy to incite the entire populace for a short time into the most violent action against the Jews. And that could happen at any time, anywhere. So we who live in the West, especially in the US and UK, we're better than others, but as they say where I come from, it's not Pashut. Okay? Now, are there any questions?
So, Yishakar, if there are any questions, two alternative approaches. One is to unmute yourselves, ask, and then go back on mute, or alternatively put it in the chat box. Rabbi Katz, that was a tremendous illuminating share and the comparison with pre-Spanish Inquisition. And
sorry, Gary, I have a question for
go for it, David.
Rabbi Katz. Are you suggesting with those comments that the political situation and the rise in anti-Semitism, both in the USA and the UK, are such that we should form committees and take preventive action in our kahillas to protect ourselves? He's muted. Gary is muted.
You're on mute, Rabbi Katz.
First of all, I'm sure you do that. Isn't that true?
Well, we have a CST. We have the protection of an organization in the United Kingdom that monitors and reports on anti-Semitism in Shmirah. But surely also the State of Israel has a department which also looks out for anti-Semitism in the Galut.
It's hard. First of all, in general, yeah, why not? That's number one. Number two, the specific ways of dealing with it vary according to the locality. You in Britain understand the best way possible within your system. I'm an American. I live in Baltimore. I have a different system. So that's a question of how. But I think you are aware, as we all are, as I'm saying, things have not gotten better in the last 20 years.
No.
As far as anti-Semitism is concerned. Right? I don't know about you, but when I grew up, it seemed to be a different world. Do you have that feeling?
Well, in the beginning, and I'm probably a little older than you with respect, it was just after the war years, and anti-Semitism was still rife in London. I remember as a schoolboy, going to school in uniform with a menorah on my cap, and hooligans in the street shouting, Hitler should have got you as well.
I hear that. You know, I understand that. But frankly, I'm not unaware. Did you feel at that time that there was a danger of violence?
Not directly, no.
Yeah, I think it was more, although it's hate speech. It seems to me the trends now, these people are going more violent. But I hope I'm wrong. I don't want to be right. But all I know is when I read on Tisha B'Av about the Crusades, and I know that this, so to speak, was like a cloudburst, I see cloudbursts happening. You know, that's what
But is that violence being directed against the Jews or BLM and so on? BLM themselves, of course, are anti-Semitic.
There's always some aspect of it. You have to watch it very carefully. There's always some aspect of it that involves the Jews, I'm sorry to say.
Okay, we have some questions in the chat box.
Okay.
The first is, could you characterize the difference between the first and later Crusades for the Jews? Were the pogroms less prevalent then?
That's complicated, but I'll tell you a short story, which is just interesting, and that has to do with the nature of Catholicism. The Second Crusade was in 1147. What happened was, very briefly, that the Crusaders were successful. They established a Crusader kingdom in Palestine and Syria. So what we would call today Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria became one large set of Crusader kingdoms. Then the Muslims started a counterattack, a successful one. And in 1147, they captured a certain town, Edessa, and that triggered the Christians into having what they call the Second Crusade. Mainly the King of France and the Holy Roman Emperor. Now, that was Louis VII. Now, when the Second Crusade began, that's smack in the middle of the period of Bali Tosfos, the Reign of Tom. And the Jews got scared out of their mind. Because all you need is an outburst of intense Catholic sentiment. And as we were just saying, it could just spill over to the Jews 1, 2, 3. And the Jews were scared out of their mind. What's interesting is that the Jews immediately appealed to the Pope. In the Middle Ages, when you had trouble, you appealed to the Pope. I know it sounds funny, but that's what they did. And the reason I say it is because it's an essential feature of Catholic teaching. They can do anything to the Jews except physically harm them. You can discriminate against them, and you should. You can legislate against them, and you should. But you can't hit them, as we say, you know. Can't physically go and do anything. That's wrong. And they said they're going to hit us. They're going to be violent. And the Pope sent the #1 Catholic clergyman in France who hated Jews on a speaking tour to say, yes, the Jews are bad and they're Christ killers and they're the scum of the earth and this and that and the other, but you can't hurt them. No pogroms. This was St. Bernard. They named a dog after him, the St. Bernard. It's Bernard of Clairvaux, right? Very famous Catholic figure of the 12th century. Very famous. And he has a book against the Jews, by the way. But like I say, but if you're Jewish in the Middle Ages, you say like this: they think I'm scum, I think they're scum, everybody's happy. Now we can be friends. He was such a good speaker that he toured all over France and he attracted crowds, and he said like this: the Jews are bad news and this and that and the other and so on and so forth. You're not allowed to make a pogrom. And so it didn't happen, which is just kind of interesting. You understand? Not on the basis of what we call today multiculturalism or 21st century liberalism, but if you're a 12th century Jew in France, you say, I'll take what I can get.
Thank you. Another question in the chat box. The Crusaders were driven by religious fervor. Do you see current issues as driven by religion or by perceived privilege?
I have to hear that again.
The Crusaders were driven by religious fervor. Do you see current issues as being driven by religion or by perceived privilege?
Religion. If you're asking me, you're asking my opinion.
Yeah.
I think it's driven by religion. I don't think people understand the depths of religious passion, and it's unfortunate.
Okay, and two tangential issues. One is, when did universities start in the Western world? Because you mentioned the secularism.
That's older, yeah. That's
but I think they're also very much religion oriented anyhow.
yes.
And the next was, in the time of the Crusades, was there discrimination against disability?
Not in legislative terms, but in social terms. But from the point of view, that's a nice question, but let me put it this way. In our ancestors' times, people were very frank. You understand? And laws were not like today. This is a big subject. Very briefly, the Greeks had a tradition that there should be different laws for different people. The Romans had a tradition there should be one law for everybody. That's how it goes. The Greeks said it's ridiculous. How can it be one law for you and me when I'm this and you're that? But the Romans said it's true, but if you make one law for everybody, it'll be better, even though doesn't necessarily make sense. In the Middle Ages, they went with the Greek style. So I think you should know this. Why was Becket killed? Because he wanted the priests not to be under the king's law, but under the church law. Correct? If a priest raped a girl, he should be tried in a priest court, ecclesiastical court, and not under royal court. And Henry, the king, wanted to no, it should all be under royal court. Notice he had multiple laws operating at the same time. That's the medieval model. There was a law for the nobles, a separate law for the clergy, a separate law for the business types, a separate law for the peasants. So in many of these countries, if a nobleman kills a peasant, you just have to pay money. If a peasant kills a nobleman, he's drawn and quartered, like that. If a nobleman kills another nobleman, it's like, and so on and so forth. That's how they saw the right way to operate. You know, that there'd be different laws for different groups. By the way, that's how the Jews fit in. There's a separate law for the Jews. That's how the halacha flourished. There's a separate law for the Jews. So when you talk about handicaps and disabilities and things like this, the laws, their attitude was, if a person has a disability, the law should reflect this. Now, on the other hand, it's balanced by religion. Religion teaches you that every person should be treated kindly. So, it depends, at different times, different places, how strongly people felt about these sorts of things. That's the way it was. But life was a lot harder. Life was a lot harder. There was no idea of legislating on behalf of the disabled.
Yishakar, if there are no further questions, then I'd like to thank you for what's been a really fabulous and fascinating share. There is a late Maariv at 9:30, and the fast goes out at 9:43. And with that, thank you very much for participating.
Have an easy fast all.
And to yourself, thank you.
Thank you very much.